the year before everything changed. Before the chains, before the ships, before the lies. Africa wasn't waiting to be discovered. It was building empires, writing books, and ruling kingdoms. This is the real story they didn't want you to know. Segment 1. The Miseducation of African History. Ask most people what they know about African history before the slave trade, and they'll pause. Maybe they'll mention pyramids or tribal life, but the deeper truths have been buried. This ignorance wasn't by accident. It was by design. The transatlantic slave trade didn't officially begin until the early 1500s, with the first documented enslaved Africans arriving in Hispaniola in 1502 under Spanish rule. But well before that, decades before that, Africa was already a continent of immense complexity and accomplishment. In 1490, Europe was just emerging from the Middle Ages, while many African civilizations were in full bloom. Yet history books often begin Africa's story with colonization and slavery, reducing centuries of brilliance to a footnote. Colonial powers intentionally erased records, burned libraries, and rewrote narratives. British colonial officers in the 19th century even classified African historical documents as dangerous. Western historians in the 18th and 19th centuries often referred to Africa as the Dark Continent, not because of skin color, but to imply cultural and intellectual darkness. They knew this wasn't true. Explorers and missionaries witnessed functioning cities, education systems, and religious orders. Why then was this version of Africa so aggressively erased? Because to enslave a people, you must first convince the world they were never free. To colonize a land, you must convince the world it was never civilized. But in truth, in 1490, Africa was home to some of the most sophisticated societies on Earth. Segment 2. The Great African Kingdoms of the 15th Century. In 1490, Africa was not a monolith. It was a vast mosaic of empires, kingdoms, and city-states, each with its own political system, culture, and economy. Let's begin with the Songhai Empire, which reached its zenith precisely during this period. In 1490, Askia Muhammad I, also known as Askia the Great, seized power and would soon launch administrative reforms that elevated Songhai into one of the greatest empires in African history. His reign, starting in 1493, would institutionalize Islam across West Africa, develop trade, and support vast centers of learning in cities like Gao and Timbuktu. The Mali Empire, founded in 1235 by Sundiata Keita, was still influential in 1490, although it had begun to decline. Mali's earlier golden age under Mansa Musa, the richest man in recorded history, who ruled from 1312 to 1337, set the stage for centuries of prosperity. His 1324 pilgrimage to Mecca brought global attention to West Africa, especially due to the massive quantities of gold he distributed en route. To the west, the Benin Kingdom, in present-day Nigeria, was thriving under the reign of Oba Ozolua, who ruled from circa 1481 to 1504. Benin City boasted wide streets, massive walls, and a highly structured bureaucracy. Portuguese traders arriving in the late 1400s were stunned by Benin's urban planning and artistry, particularly the famed Benin bronzes, which depicted the history and spiritual life of the kingdom. In the central region, the Kingdom of Congo was already interacting diplomatically with Portugal by 1483, sending ambassadors and negotiating trade. King Nzinga Nkuwu, who would later convert to Christianity in 1491, ruled over a kingdom with provinces, taxation, and organized governance. Farther east, the Ethiopian Empire known as Abyssinia was under the rule of Emperor Eskender, 1478 to 1494. This Christian empire had survived Islamic expansion and continued to correspond with European kingdoms. The famed rock-hewn churches of Lalibela, carved centuries earlier, were places of pilgrimage and architectural awe. Africa in 1490 was diverse, diplomatic, and in dialogue with the world. These were not tribes in the jungle, they were states, nations, and civilizations. Segment 3. Trade, Science, and Education. Before colonization. The economic activity in Africa during the 15th century was not only vibrant, it was global. Through the trans-Saharan trade routes, the Songhai and Mali empires exchanged gold, salt, textiles, and ivory with North African and Middle Eastern markets. Timbuktu became a linchpin in this network, housing markets, mosques, and the world-renowned University of Sankore. Founded in the 14th century, Sankore University in Timbuktu had become one of the intellectual capitals of the Islamic world by 1490. Students studied Quranic theology, astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and grammar under esteemed scholars like Ahmed Baba, who authored more than 40 books and had a personal library of 1,600 volumes. The Timbuktu manuscripts, dating as far back as the 1200s and flourishing through the 1500s, number in the hundreds of thousands today, covering science, law, philosophy, medicine, and mysticism. In a time when most of Europe's population was illiterate, African scholars were copying and preserving scientific texts. Along the East African coast, the Swahili city-states like Kilwa, Sofala, Mombasa, and Malindi were flourishing through Indian Ocean trade. As early as 1498, Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama would arrive in Mombasa and document the wealth and complexity of the coastal cities. Arab, Persian, and African merchants dealt in gold, spices, ivory, and fine cloths. In southern Africa, the Kingdom of Zimbabwe, though in decline by 1490, had previously constructed massive stone complexes, like Great Zimbabwe, a city that peaked between the 11th and 15th centuries. The great enclosure still stands today, testament to African engineering without mortar. Across the continent, Africans weren't waiting to learn, they were teaching. Segment 4. Spirituality, Art, and Social Innovation. Spiritual life in 1490. Africa was as diverse as its people. In the Islamic regions of West Africa, Sharia law was integrated into state governance. Mosques were centers of learning and community, while Sufi mysticism thrived alongside orthodoxy. Christianity in Ethiopia had its own ancient roots, traced to the 4th century when King Ezana of Aksum adopted the faith. In 1490, Ethiopian Christians practiced a liturgy older than most Western rites, and their churches, carved directly into mountains, testified to a faith built on permanence. Traditional African religions, practiced in kingdoms like Benin, Congo, and among the Akan, Yoruba, and Zulu, were based on balance, nature, ancestry, and cosmic law. Systems like Ifa divination or Nsibidi script reflected deep cosmologies and ethical frameworks. Art flourished not as ornament, but as sacred record. The Benin bronzes detailed royal lineages and religious scenes. Yoruba wood carvings captured mythological figures. The Adinkra symbols of the Ashanti conveyed proverbs and philosophical wisdom, communication through visual geometry. Socially, African civilizations experimented with governance models. Councils of elders, matrilineal succession, guild systems, and religious tolerance were practiced across multiple regions. Women like Queen Nzinga of Ndongo and Matamba, who would rise later in 1624, had precedence in queenship, including the Kandake rulers of Nubia. This was a continent with law, order, and structure, not savagery. And it worked until it was violently disrupted. Segment 5. Why was this hidden from the world? With all this sophistication, why does so little survive in public consciousness? Because from the 15th century onward, as Europe expanded through maritime exploration, it also sought justification for conquest. The doctrine of discovery, declared by the Catholic Church in 1493, gave Christian monarchies the divine right to seize non-Christian lands and enslave their peoples. When Portuguese and Spanish explorers encountered Africa, they didn't see equals, they saw opportunity. African history had to be rewritten to fit the agenda of colonizers. This meant labeling empires as tribal, religions as primitive, and rulers as tyrants. Colonial administrators, missionaries, and scholars began destroying indigenous records. The British in West Africa, the French in the Sahel, the Belgians in the Congo, all took part in the systematic erasure of indigenous history. This is why the Timbuktu manuscripts were hidden in crates and desert caves for centuries. Why Benin's artworks were stolen and now rest in European museums. Why African languages were suppressed and replaced with colonial tongues. Africa's erasure wasn't just accidental. It was a global project of silence and power. Final message, now you know. In 1490, Africa wasn't behind, it was ahead. Before the chains, there were crowns. Before the colonizers, there were calendars, cosmologies, and codes of law. Before the first slave ship ever set sail, Africa had already sailed across oceans of achievement. Your history didn't begin with slavery. It began with sovereignty. Don't let others define your beginning or your end. Drop a comment. What blew your mind about Africa in 1490? Like this video, subscribe, and share this with someone who deserves to reclaim their heritage. Because when you know where you come from, you'll never again believe that you were ever meant to be enslaved.